Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Leadership Lounge with Marlowe Foster. I wanted to have a little chat with you today about the demise of the cooperative middle. One of the most frustrating things about the current state of our politics is the evaporation of that cooperative middle. No longer are politicians focused on real solutions that impact the majority of Americans, but they have become obsessed with outlefting the left or outrighting the right. Now, let's be clear. An elected leader has a responsibility to represent the interests of his or her district. But just as important is the responsibility to the broader public pursuing policy that enhances the overall public good. Due to the historical impact of the redistricting process, district-level general elections are by and large no longer in reality contested. The real battle is the intra-party primary that often forces candidates to take unreasonable positions on public policy. I speak with authority on this issue based on my experience in government affairs at the local, state, and federal level. Over the last 5 years, and quite frankly even longer, too often I've seen middle-of-the-road Democrats and Republicans shift policy positions based on their worry of not being perceived as liberal enough or conservative enough in order to avoid an intra-party primary. While this may serve their purposes in their respective party primaries, it is typically damaging to the interests of their broader district and the overall public interest. I spend some time on the golf course, and I remember talking to a golf buddy of mine who talked about the difficult shots that you'd have to hit over water or the tight chip. And he would say, you know what, Marlowe, you have to have courage to play this game. The same is true about politics. Real leaders have courage. Not the ability to shame or play on your fears, but the ability to tell you what you don't necessarily want to hear, but need to hear. The ability to lead and make the case that there is something larger than the individual, which is the common good. We're going to examine some of those historical leaders that have been able to thread the middle or at least bring people from the other side of the aisle to their cause. Before we get to some of those middle-of-the-road leaders or those who are willing to cross the aisle to get things done, I wanted to read a little piece from Molly Ball, Moderates, Who Are They and What Do They Want? In a couple of the opening paragraphs in her article. It often seems there's no center in American politics anymore. Increasingly polarized camps on the right and left hold diametrically opposed and irreconcilable views on seemingly every issue. And yet more than a third of American voters call themselves neither liberal or conservative, but moderate, indicating a substantial chunk of dissenters from the left-right paradigm. Are they just confused? Are they closet ideologues with strongly partisan opinions, but a distaste for labels? Are they politically disconnected? What, in short, is their deal? So I was doing some research and found the Bipartisan Policy Center. And they did an analysis of the history of bipartisanship in our country. And there's several things that they noted in terms of watershed moments that required bipartisanship and kind of threading the needle, threading the center, finding that middle of the road compromise. The first was the Great Compromise. In debating a new model for self-rule that would eventually become the Constitution, states delegates in the summer of 1787 were so intensely divided over the difficult idea of congressional representation that the very topic threatened to end the Constitutional Convention. Representatives from small states were loath to approve any plan that tampered with the equal representation they currently enjoyed under the Articles of Confederation. Representatives from large populous states who wanted proportional representation thought the current system was obviously unfair. It was Connecticut's well-respected Robert Sherman who proposed a compromise, a proportional House of Representatives and a Senate with equal representation. An idea that seems very familiar to us now, but was so radical in 1787 that at first it was dismissed by the group. Eventually, the Connecticut Compromise, known as the Great Compromise, was adopted, and the opposing sides in the debate each felt vindicated. We also have seen, based on Doris Kearns Goodwin's work, A Team of Rivals, the impact of President Lincoln really choosing a group of people with different mindsets, bringing them together to a great cause. And I just want to read a little bit regarding the team of rivals. As the smaller political parties were evolving into what was to become the Republican Party, each faction representing differing viewpoints on slavery and federal power had a favorite son in the presidential election. By the time of the Republican Party convention, 3 men representing these factors emerged as party favorites: New York Senator Seward, Ohio Governor Chase, and Missouri Judge Bates. That all 3 lost the presidential nomination to a country lawyer, Abraham Lincoln, was the first surprise of 1860. That Lincoln won the general election and then appointed all of his Republican rivals to the cabinet was the second. Lincoln later added a Democrat, Edward Stanton, as his war secretary. This was Lincoln's so-called team of rivals. It was a watershed moment in politics, and later Lincoln explained himself to a reporter by saying he felt he had no right to deprive the country of its strongest minds simply because they sometimes disagreed with him. Lincoln rallied his team of rivals, found a center way, a cooperative path, and got the 13th Amendment to the Constitution passed.
Euclid's first common notion is this: things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. That's a rule of mathematical reasoning. It's true because it works. Has done and always will do. In his book, Euclid says this is self-evident. You see, there it is, even in that 2,000-year-old book of mechanical law. It is a self-evident truth that things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other.
We move on to what the Bipartisan Policy Center has to say about the Civil Rights Act. With civil rights marches and racial violence dominating the news, the issue of African Americans' legal rights could no longer be ignored. A civil rights bill proposed by congressional Democrats and supported by the White House had just passed the House of Representatives when in early 1964, the Senate took it up for debate. 21 of the Senate's 67 Democrats were from the South and publicly opposed the bill. As the bloc, they began what became the longest filibuster in Senate history. The Senate's Democratic leaders needed Republican votes to stop the filibuster, and Democratic Majority Leader Mike Mansfield asked his counterpart, Republican Senator Everett Dirksen, to step in. I appeal to the distinguished minority leader, whose patriotism has always taken precedence over his partisanship, to join me in finding the Senate's best contribution to the resolution of this grave national issue. Mansfield said. Dirksen did more than join with Mansfield. He exhorted his colleagues to end not just the filibuster, but America's difficult past and bring the Civil Rights Act to a vote. I appeal to all senators, he told the chamber. We are confronted with a moral issue. Today, let us not be found wanting. With Dirksen's leadership, 27 Republican senators joined 44 Democrats to end debate on June 10, 1964. The bill passed 19 days later.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Negro won his freedom then. He wins his dignity now. 5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions, divisions which have lasted all too long. Its purpose is national, not regional. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country. So, Tonight I urge every public official, every religious leader, every business and professional man, every working man, every housewife, I urge every American to join in this effort to bring justice and hope to all our people and to bring peace to our land.
And one of my favorite times of bipartisanship, of middle-of-the-road leadership, of finding compromise was the Welfare and Reform Act of 1996. Here's what the Bipartisan Policy Center has to say. Despite a bitterly divided government in 1996, Congress passed and Bill Clinton signed into law one of the most sweeping changes to the country's welfare system. Welfare programs had long been a politically dividing line between liberals and conservatives, but by 1996, the threat of intergenerational dependency on government welfare was clear to members of both parties. The Congress, working with the White House, walked a tightrope that made welfare opponents and supporters alternately elated and enraged. Work requirements and child support enforcement were strengthened. This was a Republican goal, while spending on education and child care was increased. This was a Democratic goal. Years later, Bill Clinton wrote that I was widely criticized by liberals who thought that the work requirements were too harsh and conservatives who thought the work incentives were too generous. But sometimes that's what compromise is.
What we are trying to do today is to overcome the flaws of the welfare system for the people who are trapped on it. We all know that the typical family on welfare today is very different from the one that welfare was designed to deal with 60 years ago. We all know that there are a lot of good people on welfare who just get off of it in the ordinary course of business, but that a significant number of people are trapped on welfare for a very long time, exiling them from the entire community of work that gives structure to our lives. Nearly 30 years ago, Robert Kennedy said, "Work is the meaning of what this country is all about. We need it as individuals, we need to sense it in our fellow citizens, and we need it as a society and as a people." He was right then, and it's right now. From now on, our nation's answer to this great social challenge will no longer be a never-ending cycle of welfare. It will be the dignity, the power, and the ethic of work.
The Leadership Lounge with Marlowe Foster is all about identifying and highlighting great leadership. Middle-of-the-road leaders who are focused on getting things done for the betterment of society. We're excited about our 2019 lineup. We're going to talk about a lot of different topics: criminal justice reform and recidivism rates, social justice issues. We're going to have discussions with faith leaders who talk about running a church, being a faith leader in difficult times in which we live. We're going to tackle some domestic violence issues and talk with those who run domestic violence agencies. We're going to have a discussion about the banking industry and the difference between rural America and urban America with their access to banking services. We're going to talk about the current state of HIV/AIDS with leaders in that community. And then we're going to have some discussions with nonprofit leaders who started their charities based on personal tragedies that happen within their families. And finally, we're going to have some tough political leaders who talk about making the tough choices for the betterment of their district, of their communities, and their state. Now, the Leadership Lounge is raring to go in 2019. We thank you for joining us today. We're going to take another couple of week break as we get ready to ramp up, and we look forward to you joining us after the turn of the year. Thanks so much to our listeners, and this is the Leadership Lounge with Marlowe Foster.